Welcome to the Shifting Our Schools podcast, where we believe learning never stops. We create innovative and flexible professional development opportunities that support the current research and thinking in education today. This week's podcast episode aspires to set you up to take another step forward on your personal learning journey. Now here's your host, Jeff Udick.
Welcome back to another episode of Shifting Our Schools. Thank you for finding some time to have a listen today. Today's episode is all about podcasting. Joe Casabona spends some time with us talking about some of his tips and tricks for getting started with podcasting and how he got started in podcasting and became a podcast coach. Make sure you check out the show notes for links to Joe's website and materials. This episode really builds on top of our Shifting Schools Getting Started with Podcasting materials over on our website. For $25, you get a video where I walk you through the production of the Shifting Our Schools podcast, along with tips and tricks for editing and recording. You'll also get a handout that has links to all of the resources you need to get started, from microphones to different hosting options. So if you are ready to start your podcast, I highly recommend our Getting Started with Podcasting pathway. This episode is a great next step on your own podcasting journey. Joe makes a living as a podcaster and a podcast coach, and talks about committing to your podcast as well as how to build community and his SMASH approach to earning income from your podcast. Whether you are an educator looking for a little extra money from a side hustle or a student ready to start your own podcast, this episode will inspire you to get started and start getting your reps in. I hope you enjoy this episode with Joe Casabona. And with that, on with the show. All right, welcome back to another episode of Shifting Our Schools. I'm so excited with our special guest here, Joe, who's a podcast coach. Joe, it's been great to just kind of be looking over your stuff, subscribing to your podcast. You're doing some great work out there, and I'm so excited to get you in front of educators and students to talk about your own podcasting journey, maybe sharing some tips and tricks if there's educators out there who want to get started with podcasts. Or my other hope is that if there's educators who have that student in their classroom, they're like, you know what, that kid needs to start a podcast, maybe give you some tips and tricks to supporting that student. So Joe, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how do you become a podcast coach?
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this. I am excited because I am a podcaster and I'm also an educator. I've taught at the college level. I've developed my own courses. I teach for LinkedIn Learning. So convergence of both worlds. I started my professional journey, I guess, my professional life as a web developer. And I started that in high school. My church came to me. Yeah. And they said they needed a website. I said, I don't know how to do that. They said, we'll pay you. And I said, I will do that. And I loved it. It was so much fun. I got to like flex like my logical side of the brain and my creative brain. So I was a full-time web developer from about the age of 14 or 15 until just a few years ago when I switched lanes. Wow. and got into content creation. And so I worked for my alma mater after I graduated in the web development side, as well as being a teacher over there, teaching web development to college students. I worked for an agency where I worked on like Disney and Disney websites and National Geographic and a whole bunch of cool things. And then, cool. And then when my daughter was born, I realized that the agency life, if people don't know, is hard work. It's a lot of work, right? Because you're kind of on call all the time. You get to work on cool projects, but like you might have to like forego nights and weekends to get a big job done on time. And as a single guy, that was fine for me. Like I enjoyed it, and I got to like do cool things that I wouldn't have got to do otherwise. But then when my daughter was born, I was like, I'm not going to miss like my kid's first steps because I'm working late for a project or whatever. So decided to go out on my own. I wanted to focus fully on podcasting and realized, and my own courses and realized I didn't really know how to run a not word of mouth web design business. Like, but I had a successful podcast. And so I landed a bunch of sponsors. They were able to float me to the end of the year. And then I kind of repeated that process with a few other podcasts, and then people started coming, hey, how did you get sponsors? How are you making money? Like, how are you not just like setting money on fire by having a podcast? And I decided to start coaching people after that. I had like pretty serious imposter syndrome. I was like, I'm not old enough to be a coach or whatever.
And then, I don't even know what I'm doing quite yet. It's just working for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Cause what you want to avoid, right, is some people will do things once and then think, yes, I will teach it, or yes, I will coach people on this.
Right.
Now you need to do exactly what I did. But that's not coaching, right? Coaching is like, what's your situation? What are your goals? Based on everything I've learned over the last several years and my experience, we'll come up with a plan for you. But then my friend Chris Lemma, who is a prolific business coach, told me, yeah, you absolutely could be a coach. He's like, you're a teacher. You're good at what you do. You've been doing it long enough. You should be a coach. And so that's when I was like, all right, I'll be a coach.
Now, how many podcasts do you have right now? Do you just have the one? I
personally have 3 that I host. Okay. And then I have, one that I co-host. It's kind of on hiatus. And then it was like a pandemic era podcast to help local businesses weather the pandemic storm.
Oh, cool.
And then I have 2 that I produce for other people.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Wow. That keeps you busy then. But you're making your own. You're working from home. You make your own hours. You kind of get that freedom of freelance work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's been a little tough, right? Because our third was born on Christmas Eve, actually, and so she's not in daycare yet. And so I've been kind of working half weeks, but she starts in daycare in a week or so as we record this. So I'll be back to full time work, which is exciting.
That's great. Yeah. Well, let's dig in here a little bit and talk about, you being a podcast coach, just maybe some recommendations you have or advice that you would have for educators who might want to start a podcast talking about either their passion or we have some teachers who, are thinking like, oh, I could start a podcast for my students in my school, for an after school club, for whatever it might be. If I'm just trying to get started, what are recommendations you have for somebody who comes to you and is like, Joe, I don't even know what to do?
Yeah, this is such a great question because usually I'm approaching it from somebody who like has a business maybe or not somebody who is maybe supporting their current job with their podcast, right? So usually I say, figure out why you want a podcast and figure out how it's going to make money, even if it doesn't make money for the first year. Have that in mind from the very beginning. But if you're an educator who's doing this to support your job or support your students, it's a little bit different, right? So what you do is you do still want to think of the why you're podcasting, right? Every podcast should solve a problem. My podcast, for example, went from telling founder stories, like specifically like the failure part of founder stories of people in the WordPress space, to actionable advice for creators specifically. So, and kind of leveraging tech. So I've made this slow move over the last few years to do that. Cause there's like a ton of founder stories podcasts out there. Right. And me as a guy, I'm not going to be able to differentiate myself that way. But as an educator, right, there are a couple of things that you need, a decent microphone, and then audio hosting. Those are really the 2 things that you would need. Now, there is free hosting with Anchor that's owned by Spotify. Free hosting with Anchor is probably the only, or for students, it's probably the only use case that I have for Anchor, right? Okay. If you're serious about I'm sorry if this is hosted on Anchor. I didn't do my research.
No, it's not. It's all good.
If you are any kind of serious about your podcast, I don't think you should host on Anchor because in the software space, we say if you are not paying for the product, then you are the product. Yeah. And so maybe it's not just the software space. So I think that there's a couple of good options for you. Buzzsprout is very affordable and they actually do have a free tier. It just that falls like I think after 2 months, your episode like falls off of the feed. Right. So if you're doing something very like semester or trimester specific, that's perfectly fine. Right. But the other one that I like, the one that I use and I like the best is Castos.
Okay.
They start at $20 a month, but something really key, especially if you're doing things specifically for students in your school, is they offer kind of native private podcasting. So you can lock down the feed so that only verified email addresses could access it. So like if you're doing something for the classroom or for an after school activity, I think Castos would be really good for that. But yeah.
I was just going to say, so I'm just thinking, because that's really good. I didn't know this was an option, and I really like that option. Is there a way that you can go in and can you lock it to a domain? Like, can I just say anybody who has an email address at schooldistrict.com can access that, or do you have to individually go in and put in every kid's email address?
That is a really good question, and I as I was saying it, I wish I knew the answer to it.
That's okay.
You know what I'm doing? I use Castos, so I can, as we're kind of talking here, I can vamp a little bit and I can let you know and double check. So the way that I know how to do it is, you just kind of physically add a subscriber, but you could also use something like Zapier to like read a CSV, right? And send each email address to, or you can get a, like kind of a generic link that you can send to all of the students, and it's still like not publicly accessible, but that's a little bit less so that would work. So I'm thinking, like, for teachers who might be listening, you could take that link and you could put it inside of your course, right? Inside Canvas or Google Classroom or whatever you're using, and only kids who had access to that course would be able to click on that link and then, load it into their podcast player and be able to go. So you can still lock it down. So that, I like that workaround. We do that a lot in education. So that's a good workaround. Yeah, totally. And then, the other kind of benefit of an email address verified user is that Castos also has an app, right? So they can put in their email address in the app, and then it'll automatically download there. I like to use my own, not my own, but I like to use Overcast for podcasting. So I'm very particular too. I definitely need a private feed because I want all of my podcasts to be in one place.
Sure. So, and you said Castos is $20 a month is the minimum for that?
Yes. I don't want to speak for them. They might have like a higher educational discount
or something.
Yeah, I would certainly ask. I always ask. I still have my University of Scranton email address, so I whenever I can.
I like that. That's great advice, because we run into that a lot. With just like, what's the free versions that are out there? And you're right, Anchor FM, if it's the only thing you have, great, go for it, use it. Buzzsprout, another good one. But when you're ready to level up, $20 a month, in the grand scheme of things, if you're doing this for your kids or you're starting your own side hustle, something that you're passionate about, $20 a month is, I think, a pretty low hanging entry point.
And if you pay for the year up front, I think it's $190. For the year, so you save some there. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like I've had textbooks that cost more than that, right?
Yeah, right.
So but yeah, I do understand that, like, especially like teachers aren't paid enough as it is, and if they have to like pay for their own thing out of pocket, like that's tough. If there's budget within the school, like that's probably also rare as we record this.
yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk a little bit too about, like, what advice would you give to a student? Let's say you have put yourself back in middle school, and you're starting to do this web developing for your church. And I'm a kid and I'm like, you know what? I want to start a podcast. If there are students out here who are listening to this, what advice would you have for some of our young podcasters who are trying to get started?
I think the most important thing for the young podcasters out there is get your reps in, right? Because you probably listen to a podcast where it's, I've been podcasting for almost 10 years, but even before that, I was a public speaker. I was in drama club from like second grade on. I'm very comfortable speaking in front of people, but that's a skill that most people have to develop. Right. So I think get your reps in, right? And I mean, maybe this generation has an easier time, right? Because they're like TikToking or live streaming or whatever.
Yeah.
But starting a podcast, I think Anchor is a good option for the students.
Yeah.
Because that is free. That's totally free. And they do have a monetization built into it, right?
Okay.
Again, I'd be wary. I wouldn't build my business on top of that. But I just read an article that like Anchor has like a bunch of like white noise podcasts that make like a bunch of money.
Wow.
So I do think it's a good option for students. And then you don't need a $400 microphone. You can get like I tested a $20 like tone or maybe a $30 like toner microphone. That's TONOR. Good enough, right? You just don't want to sound like you're recording in a bathroom stall is basically the goal here, right? So that's a USB microphone, plugs right into your computer, and then your computer has some recording app on it already, right? So QuickTime or GarageBand for Mac, Windows/Sound Recorder for Windows, and then or Anchor lets you record, I think, directly to it. I think directly too, right? So you have a lot of options there, but I think the most important thing is get your reps in and understand that like you're not going to get like hundreds of downloads for the first several months, as long as you understand that going in. Because you don't want that to be discouraging. Like I host workshops now that like 1 or 2 people buy tickets to. I still do them because it's part of my membership. But so again, if you're not established, especially if you're not established in a space, it's not magically going to get downloads.
Yeah. And what I love about this is like we have been interviewing a lot of people from different industries. And every time we ask this question about what advice would you give to students to start down, a similar path if this is something they want to do, the same answer continues to come. Get your reps in.
Yeah.
And even to the point, like just start like recording stuff and putting it out there. Like your first podcast probably going to suck. Because it's your first podcast, and then you get better and you get better audio quality and you figure out better ways to edit it, but you got to get your reps in, right? Like I go back and sometimes listen to the first episode we did of this podcast, which was insane. Like I was living in Shanghai. My co-host was in Hong Kong. We're interviewing somebody from Thailand. And it's over Skype because that's all we had in 2006. Yep. So it's just like this. It was so bad. Like there's so much static behind, but you do it, right? That's episode 1. And then you continue to grow. So
done is better than perfect.
I love that. Yeah. Done is better than perfect.
You don't want to, there's a balance, right? Because you don't want to put out trash, but like you also, it's not going to sound like NPR the first time you do it.
Yeah. That's so
My
true.
first podcast was terrible. It was me and a bunch of friends, like a roundtable discussion over Skype. We're talking over each other. I'm a terrible moderator. And we didn't do any research. Like that show was terrible, but we did like 15 episodes and I learned how to podcast in those 15 episodes.
So great.
And then I launched my current podcast, which makes me 6 figures. Like it's so, get your reps in, I guess
get your reps in.
Yeah.
That might even be the title of this episode. Get your reps in. I like
that.
And that goes for educators as well, right? Like you got to get your reps in. You just got to start creating stuff. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about building a podcast community. And I was listening to one of your latest episodes and you were interviewing someone about this idea of how do you start to build a community around your podcast, and then from community to engagement, and kind of like, where do you find listeners? Like I put this podcast out there, it's on Spotify or it's on Apple or wherever. Then how do you start building a community? What advice do you have for people?
Yeah, that's really hard, right? Because longtime podcasters will know that it can kind of feel like a one-way street. If you're putting it out there and then people aren't necessarily writing back, you can see download numbers. But I think the important thing for you to do is have a good call to action that is clear from the very beginning, right? So you listen to a lot of podcasts and they'll say like right at the end, they'll be like, don't forget to rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts, and also check out the show notes, and also join our mailing list, and also share it with a friend. That's too many things, and you've probably already lost your listener. So what I like to do, and I'm actually experimenting with dynamic ad insertion for this now because I have a bunch of older episodes, but
cool.
I like to put it at the beginning. Hey, real quick before we get started, I just want to let you know that I have a newsletter that goes out every Monday for free. It recaps these episodes. It gives you some quick hits, and it'll tell you what I'm working on. If you are interested in that, sign up over at URL, right? It's right at the beginning. It's very clear. I reinforce that throughout the episode. So the call to action could not be clearer. And that has helped when I did it for my newsletter. Now I'm doing it for my memberships. And the other thing I would recommend is having a good show notes page. Again, to send people, right? To send people to, because I'll have a feedback form there. My community is not, it's part of the membership, but if you're building community, send them to a Facebook page or wherever your community happens to be, right? I think a lot of people hate Facebook. Right. I do too, but if I knew like 90% of my audience was hanging out over there, I'd create a Facebook page.
Yeah. And I'm thinking like for a student right now, like you might need to, that might be TikTok or that might be Instagram. Right. You know, where are other kids that you're trying to reach hanging out? You might have to create that account for your podcast and start sending people like, hey, follow me on TikTok for more information, or follow me on Instagram to see whatever it is that you want to see. Yeah, right. And exactly. And then like, let's use TikTok, right? Because I'm trying to get into that now. I'm an elder millennial. So I've fought TikTok. I'm like, I don't understand it. But I've been told time and time again that it does help grow your podcast or your business or whatever. So you can release clips. I think that Anchor makes it pretty easy to create like audiograms maybe. But if not, there's a free app called Headliner that'll do that, and just recently started integrating directly with TikTok, right? So you can release clips of your podcast, and then you could offer extra advice. Hey, by the way, like I just recorded a great interview with Jeff. We talked about higher education and what podcasting means. These are the 3 things we talked about. Look for that episode. And then when people like or comment or ask you questions, then you can engage. And then you can, again, send them to your newsletter or send them to whatever other place that you want to get them to. I always say newsletter because that's like the thing that you control. Yeah, like, right. Even if ConvertKit goes away tomorrow, that's what I use. Even if ConvertKit goes away tomorrow, I have a list of email addresses that I can get from ConvertKit, which is, you can't get that from Facebook or I mean, podcasting, you have no idea, right? Right. Exactly. You barely know what app they're coming from. So yeah, right. That's tough. Yeah, that's true. So I like that. Those are, some really good advice. Is a call to action, whatever it might be, whether you have a newsletter, you have TikTok, Instagram, like know where your community is and find a way to have a call of action to join me there. Because to your point, and one thing I like that you really brought up is like, even on this podcast, I know how many downloads we get. I know what country they come from, but I don't know who they are. Like I have no idea who these people are, but so it's great to do that, which is why, and to your point, I should be telling everybody, you want follow up. There's a newsletter that comes out every Wednesday after the episode that has even more information so all these links I'm writing down will be in our newsletter. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're not subscribed to our newsletter, you can head over to shiftingschools.com and sign up right there on the homepage. Thanks for reminding me to do that, Joe. See, I'm learning already. My pleasure. Awesome. I'm gonna sign up, right? Because I'm a little bit of an egomaniac, so I'm gonna want to know. You're gonna want to know. I love it. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about other ways that you can help people who want to get started, whether they be students or teachers or somebody else listening to this. You actually have a course called Podcast Liftoff that helps people not only start podcasts but earn income through them. If there's an educator out there who is looking for a side hustle or some advice, can you maybe talk a little bit about that course? And then how do you even start to set this up to get to that income stream? Yeah. So I kind of alluded to this before. If you want to do anything more than just talking to a microphone with your buddies for a while, the first thing that you need to do is think, what problem does my podcast solve? And how is it going to make money? And a lot of people are like, but Joe, I don't know if it's going to make money. What if it's not? That doesn't matter. You need to know from the beginning how, if it does, right? And sponsorships is one way, right? I actually have a framework for this. It's called the SMASH framework.
5 ways your podcast can make money. Sponsorship is number 1. That's what, again, like all of my coaching clients are like, how do I get my first sponsor? So I'm like, fine, I'll lean into this. I used to lean into like, don't get sponsors, do something else. But it's like, it's very rewarding, and it's the most visible way that people can get monetization. M stands for memberships, right? So you build up a strong community, maybe through your newsletter. And then the common model right now is like $5 a month or $50 a year. That's what my membership is. You get maybe ad-free, extended content, behind the scenes stuff. For my membership soon, I'm going to make a video on how to like create like an automatically updated upcoming guests panel that you could put on your website, right? Like to entice people, because I saw somebody do that. It was a good idea. So extra content essentially for the membership, right? A stands for affiliate links. This is the lowest barrier to entry, but also probably the lowest trickle unless you find the right affiliate program. And this is kind of where like solving the problem and figuring out how it's going to make money go hand in hand, right? If I'm solving a problem that is underwater basket weaving is hard, right?
Right.
Well, maybe I'll join a few affiliate programs where I can find like a waterproof bubble that I can weave my basket in. Maybe I'll find like the most rust-proof needles to do weaving in, and I'll join those affiliate programs, and I'll recommend those on the show, and I'll make it clear they're affiliate links, and I'll put them in the show notes, and I'll have a speakable URL. But then you get a small kickback anytime somebody uses your link to make the purchase. And there are really good affiliate programs out there, right? Like Amazon is one that everybody goes to because a lot of people shop on Amazon, but theirs ain't great. You know, I think it's like 3% most of the time. So if somebody buys like a $10 thing, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Whereas I just joined one where it's like 5%, but like the average order is like $500, right? So that's, you know, decent. That's like $25 just for like recommending a product. So, so that was A for affiliates. The second S is selling. If you sell a product or service, then you want to build your podcast around that, solving that problem, and then talking about how the best solution to that problem is your product or service. And then H is helping. So that's courses, coaching, consulting. Again, you want to use your podcast to establish your expertise, establish your authority, answer listener questions, and then people will be like, man, Jeff sure knows a lot about that. Maybe I'll reach out to him and see if he'll coach me.
Very cool. I love that. Thank you for that. That's great advice. SMASH. That's an easy one to remember. Right. We like our acronyms in education, so that's good.
Yes. Yeah. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out a good one. I hate acronyms, right? But I was like, but every framework is like a word. So I have like the SMASH framework and the CALM framework.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. I like that. Yeah, I like that. Any final words of advice for educators or students out there who, are looking to get into podcast or other things that we maybe didn't cover that you think are important for them to know?
I think the most important thing is it can be discouraging at first. You pick something you're passionate about, help people solve a problem, get your reps in and be consistent. If you do those things, eventually your podcast will bear fruit, right? But I think people are like, I'm putting my podcast out there. It's going to get thousands of downloads the first day. It won't. It'll be like your mom and like 4 people who follow you on Twitter or whatever.
Right.
So there's that piece of advice. There's get your reps in. I usually recommend that you record 2 or 3 like test episodes to see if you actually like it. Because maybe podcasting is not the medium for you, right? Maybe you're a better writer. Maybe you're better with video. But try it out to see if you like it. And then the last thing I'll say, just because this is a drum that I've been beating for like a few weeks now, is don't title your episodes with episode number : guest name. Because people who are subscribed, like that's fine, like they've already subscribed, but you also want to please the Google robots, right? And people aren't searching for like episode number, or most people who are Googling the name of your guest is your guest. So you want to title your podcast something different, right? Like, 3 important tips for educators and students to start a podcast, right? That would be a good episode name for this. And then most podcast apps will add the episode number in anyway later on. Right. So, but you want people to discover your podcast with an enticing title and an enticing description. So don't include in this episode as like the first 3 words of your description either. People know that it's an episode if they're looking for that podcast.
Ooh, I love that. That's some great advice. Something I need to think about too, because I think I do the episode number : thing still. So
yeah, I did it for like the first 200 episodes, and I had my VA like go back and I made a spreadsheet. I changed all the titles, and I had my VA go and change them. And the same thing with, I looked at the descriptions and I'm like, these are all terrible. So like I updated them, right? Because that's you want to. It
matters.
Yeah, absolutely, and it helps, right? Because you have precious space in podcast apps or in search result descriptions to entice the person to click.
Yeah, so good. Such great advice. If people want to learn more about you, your podcast coaching, or your podcasts, where should they go? How do they reach out to you?
You can find me over at casabona.org. Everything is over there. So it'll links to my coaching, links to my podcast. And there's a nice big box on there for you to join my newsletter, which is called Podcast Tips. It's free. It comes out twice weekly, and it gives you tips for how to grow and monetize your podcast.
Awesome. Joe, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I've learned some stuff that I need to go back and think about for my own podcast, which is why, part of the reason why I love doing podcasts is it's so much learning for me. It's my own learning vehicle as well. So I appreciate you being here and sharing your tips and tricks about getting started with podcasting.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I had a lot of fun.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Shifting Our Schools. If you found this episode helpful or inspiring, please make sure to subscribe and leave the team a 5-star rating. If you want to learn more about the Shifting Schools team or download our free resources, head over to shiftingschools.com to see what's on offer now. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week for another episode to keep rethinking the shifts our schools need.